Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev Podcast. So when work is urgent and emotionally demanding, people slowly lose the space to think clearly, and this has a huge impact. Today, we're invited a guest with a unique ability to create spaces where people can think, feel, and work well, even in environments shaped by trauma and relentless pressure. Gareth Evans is lead for Specialist Organisational Development in Betsi Cadwaladr University Health Board. Gareth is someone we've wanted to have on the podcast for a while now. He's a facilitator, coach, and he's also the developer of the Conversational Spaces Framework for working with individuals, groups, and teams. He's also the co-developer of the OD Practice Framework for working with organisations with organisational trauma. His career is an example of how to become an accomplished OD practitioner doing life-changing work where you don't necessarily have a clear path that you're following. Gareth's career has started in mental health nursing, and along the way has completed a whole host of fascinating courses and accreditations along the way, which we're really keen to explore. And this ranges from human systems dynamics, relational organisational gestalt, to systemic constellations, and even clean coaching, to name a few. So Gareth, Danny and I are absolutely delighted to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for making time today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So just to kick us off, just a nice easy one, just paint a bit of a picture about what your work involves and what your role looks like day to day.
Yeah, as Garen was saying, I'm the lead for Specialist OD in Betsi Cadwaladr, and we are a small resource. There are four of us at the moment, 3 in the team and 1 member of staff on bank. So that's Kirsten and Melanie in the team with me and Graham on bank. And we are the team for an organisation of around about 20,000 staff. So Betsi is a health board in Wales, covers the whole of North Wales. What we offer is, I suppose, a set of different OD practices. So internal consultation, development work with people, business partner colleagues and other workforce partners, and where indicated, direct intervention work with teams and services. And that tends to be the broad elements of our offer. And part of my role as the lead, obviously, is to try and raise the profile of OD in our health board, but also across Wales. There's quite an active community of OD practitioners. We have a lovely little network that we're slowly kind of spreading into England as well. So anybody and everybody is welcome to attend. And it's that kind of whole thing around, I suppose, raising awareness of what a team like us is doing and helping connect that into some of the senior spaces in the organisation. So I guess working to position that in a strategic way.
Fabulous. And what feels distinctive about doing OD inside the NHS? Because it's a particular sort of environment.
Yeah, well, I think it's an incredibly complex environment. So the health board that I work in, which is consistent with Wales, is that we are an integrated health board. So the situation is different in England. Obviously, there are kind of providers of services, but there are also commissioners of services. So it tends to be set up slightly different. Betsi, like other health boards in Wales, does everything. So from primary care services right through to secondary care, hospital-based services through to specialist services like forensic mental health. So it's the whole range. So I think that, in a sense, brings us into contact with a number of very different contexts, some corporate, some clinical, in very different spaces with very different types of teams and setups. And I think that makes the work, it's always live, it's always rich, it's always, to use a word that's quite trendy at the moment, emergent work. I think you can go in with a sense of what the plan will be, and very quickly that evaporates in the mist.
As you said, you're a small team. There's 3 of you plus somebody on bank working in a really large, complex organisation. So how do you decide where you're going to place your energy and your time? And how do you decide what you're not going to do? What guides that decision?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that's something that's still evolving. As a team, we've, Kirsten and Melanie have been in the team since around about May, June time last year. So it feels still like it's a very young service. I was working with a colleague, Katie, before that. Katie moved on to another role. So as a kind of a new team, we're still very much, I think, defining our offer. And that's rich and creative. So I think the OD work that we do with teams, that comes through conversations with our people business partner colleagues. We have kind of meetings across the health board where we get together as people and OD colleagues to kind of explore what's I guess, lively in the system, and then thinking about where there's a team that may need something a little bit more than a people business partner might be able to offer. So that can be at times a little bit like who shouts the loudest. So there is some work to do. We've got a new exec director coming into the organisation in February around thinking about what the strategic priorities might be for a team like ourselves, because there is something about how do you make best use of the resource, which I think, Danny, is what you're kind of alluding to. So at the moment, we rock up where the need is. I would like us to be able to think about that in a bit more of a strategic way. So I think that's next steps for us.
And is there, kind of on a personal level, is there kind of work that tends to pull you in more strongly than others? Is there the kind of work that you're drawn to do?
I do think, and I think you have to be careful, don't you? As you named in the intro, my background is in mental health work. So that kind of work that's at the edges of the therapeutic is a pull for me, and I have to be mindful of my boundaries and think about what's calling me toward that. But I think the NHS is a system like many that went through COVID. I think for NHS staff, there was a particular direct and very visceral and very existential kind of implication to that. And I think we do see trauma and, and real kind of emotional kind of, challenge in some of the teams we work with. And I do find that work really interesting. I try and hold a systemic perspective on things like conflict and tension and try and be curious about what that's kind of suggesting about the system around people, rather than saying there's a problematic individual. There's an individual who is embodying something on behalf of the system, perhaps. So how can we be curious about what that might be? So I think that kind of systemic work, that trauma-informed work that feels complex, knotty, crunchy, I think that's the stuff that really interests me. The stuff that sometimes feels like it's difficult to know where you're going to go to next. And perhaps that's, again, part of the mental health background and the work that I used to do previously.
So, Gareth, I guess one thing, the OD team, so where does it sit within the organisation? Does it sit as part of HR? Does it sit on its own? And what was the process for setting it up and sort of commissioning it into the organisation so people had an appreciation of the value you could create?
Yeah, so it sits within workforce. So people and organisation development is the name of the directorate. It's always been separate to HR, so separate and connected. And I think what's happened in our OD service, I'll use that bigger term for a moment, over time, is that I think when I first came into OD work in the health board, getting on for 12 years ago now, I think it was very much like OD teams are in the NHS. A lot of times, you were somebody that did a lot of different things. So you might be doing some leadership development, you might be doing some staff engagement work, some kind of staff survey work, cultural transformation work, and then some team intervention, some coaching. And I think that's brilliant. It's really rich, and that's a great way to kind of cut your teeth. But after a while, it can feel like each of those elements gets stretched thin because they each need some kind of real focus and commitment. So we made a decision, I think about 18 months, 2 years ago, to differentiate the elements of OD. So that's when we created pure L&D team. There's a staff engagement team, there's a culture team, and there's a specialist OD team alongside. Things like staff retention, workforce modernisation, freedom to speak up. So all of these things sit within the OD portfolio. And that's been a really interesting journey, differentiating. And then I think there is work then in terms of how do you help colleagues appreciate that our little bit of the service, specialist OD, isn't the same bit that does the leadership development work. And I think that's an ongoing conversation. I think those kinds of things are conversations that you need to keep having with people.
Obviously, common wisdom is that most HR teams have OD as part of it as well. What benefits and trade-offs do you get from just sitting as your own function?
I think there's a benefit in terms of, I suppose, that capacity to really go deep into the practice. Because OD is such, I would describe it as a field of practice. And as a field of practice, there are so many different ways of thinking about OD and approaching it. So I do think you get to explore that. I think the risks come in that disconnection with colleagues sometimes, or that need to really work at maintaining connection because everybody's doing their own stuff. And now people business partners have a level of OD task and role in their work. So we would be working with people business partners to build that OD capacity. But clearly then there are the usual things around capacity and demand for everybody. I think those are the risks, that it can become separated. The benefits are in that ability to go deep into the space into the work.
Yeah, because I think it's a really big curiosity for a lot of people, which is like, where can OD do its best work? And, there is that we've only met a few of the OD teams that actually sit outside of HR. So this is going to be really interesting for people. How do you ensure that you are coordinated and coherent with your colleagues that are doing OD style work? All of it has an element of it as well. Is it intentional design, or is it kind of like informal relation? How do you make sure that stays consistent?
Yeah, something of both. So we've set up people and OD meetings. So the health board is kind of structured into different areas. There's an east, central, west area because the health board is so large. And then there are PAN services. So each of those areas has its own people and OD meeting. So that's an informal space that happens on a fortnightly basis where, HR, OD, occupational health, staff wellbeing support services, quality and diversity colleagues can connect together, can bring particular concerns, but also just check in around, what's emerging in the spaces that they're working in, where are the hotspots, where's the systemic intelligence, what's potentially coming down the road next. So I think that informal kind of connection in a formal kind of meeting that has minutes and kind of, can be followed up with actions is really important. We then also offer the consultation conversations that are primarily for people, business partner colleagues at the moment. And that's another kind of space where they can maybe bring a particular team that they've started working with, where they think there's maybe something more that needs to be explored, or to think about a piece of work that they're doing that they would just like a little bit more guidance around. So that you were mentioning it in your intro, Garen, that ability to create spaces where people can just step outside of the kind of the relentless flow and churn and just take a moment, maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, to begin to think and I guess to explore in a more expansive way. And I think we're offering some of that. And then we do some partnering work where that's possible. So again, we're a small resource. We have to really think carefully about where we allocate that kind of effort to. But I think because I'm somebody that's kind of relational in my take, the quality of those relationships, not just with the teams and the people we work with, but with our colleagues, is essential. So that's, again, I think that's constant work. That is part of the OD intervention in itself, isn't it? Is to kind of create opportunities for connection and collaboration.
You said something about 5 minutes ago, and I've just been desperate to ask you a question, but I wanted to understand more about the context. But you said somebody's embodying something on behalf of the system. That's a fascinating area, isn't it? Could you just explain that in a little bit more detail, what that looks like, and maybe give examples of work that you've done in the past that covers that?
Yeah, definitely. So initially, my sense of that comes from systemic family work. So as a clinician, being involved in family therapy clinics and working with children, adolescents, families, so in CAMS, child adolescent mental health services, and often seeing that a child might be the presenting, person, the referral is about the child, there's some concern about the child's behaviour. What you would want to do as a systemic practitioner is be really curious about the context. So what's the context within which that behaviour might be emerging? That might be the family context. That could be the school context. That could be the social context. And just, I suppose, holding a curiosity as to what else might be in play. That children sometimes embody things. So they are the one who starts to present with some concern because there are other things happening in one of those contexts, aren't being attended to or can't be easily articulated. And I think the same thing happens in teams and services. Part of my background training is in psychodynamic models. So you're talking about unconscious process, emotional process. I think organizational systems hold strong emotions, anxiety, hope, despair, things that aren't always easily talked about. I guess there's a narrative that we should focus on the positive. We should always be strengths, growth mindset, all that kind of thing that I think are features of our field, and those are important things. And there are other things going on, and I think that's going on in teams all of the time. The stuff around belonging and whether we're included, whether we're excluded. And I think sometimes people take up a role in a team that articulates something of that on behalf of others. So they may be the one who has the most, in system psychodynamics language, I think it's valence or valence, not sure how you pronounce the word. So they have a resonance with a particular, almost like emotional tone in the system, and become the one who embodies it and expresses it. And in the process, potentially sets themselves as potentially being problematic. So they take on the difficult things on behalf of others. So that's the stuff I'm interested in. And obviously, my most recent forays into learning around systemic constellations has a whole kind of theory around things that we get entangled with that may be to do with system history as well. Things about people who've been excluded where there's still the dynamic in play, almost like ghosts in the system. So does that kind of get into it enough?
It does, yeah, very much so. I'm going to follow it with a horribly vague question, so I'll let you pick on this how you wish.
We're OD practitioners, we do vague.
So if you do have a system where there are strong, possibly unnamed emotions at play, so you said despair, frustration, anger, grief, whatever, like, how do we start to address those things? Because like I said, sometimes they're not always welcome. Sometimes our behavior is post-rationalized, all those kind of things. So where do we begin?
So I think you have to take that straight back to the beginning of the OD work itself, and that's that classic stuff around how you set up the contract for work. So how do you begin a piece of work and what do you negotiate? You almost have the mandate for. And I think that's really important. So as a specialist OD team, we think an awful lot about how we approach work with a particular service, so we may, based on the information that we've gleaned, create something of a working hypothesis or formulation. We wonder if this is going on. And that then might inform initial conversations with sponsors, team leaders, or the team as a whole in terms of, what are we allowed to move towards? Is it okay if we name things that we think might be not being said? So I think that negotiation of what's within scope is really important, because some of this stuff is potentially very difficult. So you have to be really thoughtful about how you approach the unsaid, because it's unsaid for a reason. And in the system, the rules of belonging may be that we don't speak about the unspeakable. Everybody knows it, the old proverbial elephant in the room, but actually it's forbidden. So I think you sense your way into systems. And then I think if you've got a contract where people initially consciously say, okay, that seems reasonable, that doesn't mean they will experience it as reasonable when it's happening. But we say yes to things without really fully knowing the implication. I then think it's about the quality of your presence and that really important OD, I guess, skill, I'd probably call it a capacity to bring that use of self. So what am I sensing? What am I feeling? What am I attuning to? Symbols and metaphors and images keep coming up in me, unbidden, as if from somewhere else in the system. So the field, if you like. And I think then it's that ability, isn't it, to articulate, do you know what? This image keeps almost like coming into my mind without me wanting it to be there. Can I just share it and see if it has resonance? Does this mean anything to anybody? Or I'm feeling really anxious, or I'm breathing it up in my chest. It's really hard to breathe, or I'm holding my breath. Does that make any sense? Is there something about, so just offering that as a tentative thing.
There's a real skill in being able to offer those things tentatively and lightly to the people you're working with. So how have you developed that over time?
And again, for me, some of that is previous work as a mental health nurse and therapeutic training, and participating in development around that. I think some of that is very good supervision. And I think that's a really important thing for the field of OD to be really exploring. What's the space for supervision of our practice? So I think I had some very good clinical supervisors, including systemic psychotherapists, who would really help me think about, okay, so you're noticing that, you sometimes very strong feelings, I really dislike this mother, or I really dislike that child, and then being able to kind of name that in a way that feels safe, because that feels very almost like problematic, I'm not supposed to have those kinds of feelings, but actually they are part of the experience sometimes. We don't necessarily like the people we work with. So being able to explore that in a way that helps you get under the skin of that. What might that be about? Is that about some of my stuff? That person reminds me of someone else, so the classic stuff around transference? Or is that something about the system itself that is being revealed to me in the way I'm feeling? And can I hold that slow down enough to be able to process it? So, and I think some of that is just about being willing to be clumsy and take risks. So I don't think it's a polished skill, Danny. I think it's something that you grow and you develop, and sometimes through real clangers and saying things that you think, oh my goodness me, can I And there's a big emphasis I think, in psychodynamic therapeutic work on relational rupture. Those moments as a therapist or as a worker when you say something that really hurts the client. So you're careless, or you misunderstand, or you ask a question that is deeply intrusive in a way that doesn't feel permissible. And then the therapeutic work then is, how do you regain the relationship? And I think that kind of stuff is also taking place in teams. Many of the teams, Kirsten, Melanie and I, are working with our teams in conflict, where that relational rupture has happened. And again, how do you create spaces where that can be approached, in a way that feels safe enough? I think you keep going, you keep developing, you learn, you make mistakes, you have to risk it.
Our search for the simple 5-step process continues.
That's step one. Settle into your body. Step 2, remember to breathe.
You've got a wonderful access to like a really good vocabulary to explain what's going on, relational rupture, and that kind of normalizes it for the practitioner, doesn't it? It's you're always trying to separate what's personal, what's my stuff, what's their stuff. But you said something a little while ago that I think I'd love to explore, and just to sort of help define, you used the word formulation. When you talk about formulation, is it like a hypothesis held lightly, and how do you go about putting one together? And how do you go about taking it forward? Because that's a big part of the work, isn't it? Because sometimes the temptation is, I can fix this. I've got a solution, and off you go.
So yeah, definitely. And again, I think the word, you can probably use the words hypothesis and formulation interchangeably. So formulation is probably more the word I would have used, again, in my previous life as a mental health clinician. And it literally is, it's that kind of working theory about what might be going on. So based on presenting concerns, based on the information you've gathered about history and precedents, thinking about context, what else might be in play. So it's that attempt to create a kind of a story or an explanation as to why the system is behaving in the way that it does. So you pull in history, you pull in current concerns, you pull in some of those contextual factors, and you try and create a narrative that might explain it. But that thing that you've just mentioned, Garen, around holding it lightly is crucial. In fact, in systemic work, you create a hypothesis and then you set out with the intention to disprove it. So you want your hypothesis to be found to be wrong or incomplete. So you're constantly asking questions to create a bigger sense. Again, I didn't see that. Right. Can I include that now, or do I need to rewrite my sense of things? So they're almost scaffolds, aren't they, that allow you to go into the work. A bit like people have favorite frameworks. And they're really useful for containing our own anxiety and allowing us to go on in what can at times feel like tricky, emotive work that can be personally risky as well as kind of professionally challenging. So I think formulations do that. They allow you to explore whether your story is resonant with that of the clients. And again, I guess the tradition of practice that I come from, you share your formulation. You're very upfront about it. This is what I think might be going on. Does that make sense to you? But it's offered tentatively and it's held lightly, with the idea that there's always a better, more complete, more multi-perspective way of making sense of it.
And it's interesting though, isn't it? Because I guess even just naming your formulation does a thing, doesn't it? You're starting the process of, we're not external people observing the system and writing down our hypothesis, are we? As soon as we start to go in and start to explore that hypothesis with people, we are creating change, and we need to take responsibility for what we're doing, don't we?
Definitely. I think our work is ethical work in that it has ethical implication. If our formulation potentially, I think, discriminates against a particular individual, is too loaded towards a particular way of telling the story, so that some people feel very excluded or damaged or, scapegoated, that has real consequence. We have power, we have influence, and a particular position that we take up in relation. And I think those things are really important to be mindful of. So it has to be tentative. And it's an interventional act. There's no getting around that. To withhold your formulation is an interventional act that could create all sorts of stories about what aren't they telling us. Sitting there smiling smugly, nodding sagely, come on, what, because people invite us in with a sense that we will offer something. And I think we have to be really thoughtful about how we set up the contract for what that might be. Can we get a contract where we agree to work alongside people rather than as some kind of expert or guru. So I think that's problematic, but that's not always what people want. People want you to, I think, like you were saying, Gary, to present the 5-step solution. Right, what you need to do is A, B, C, D, and you'll get E. So I'm not sure I've found that. I sometimes crave that myself because I think that offers certainty, doesn't it? And yes, I have Steve Hurston would call it the silver bullet. His book is about the fact that there aren't any silver bullets, alas. Or perhaps not so, alas.
You mentioned one thing there. I guess one of the things when I was studying is had it drilled into me. Every system has a logic to it. It's your job to work out what the logic is. Like, things happen for a reason, don't they? And then you can start to understand how you're changing. How do you go about finding the logic of the system? Like, what is actually potentially driving it?
I think that's in conversation, that's in relationships. So I think our work starts and ends with people. So the only way of revealing the logic of the system is to participate in it with others, and I think if, again, we are tracking our own internal experience alongside that of others and are able to create spaces where people can begin to share something of themselves, I think the logic of the system comes into play. I do use, some sort of framework in terms of the logic of the system. I'm interested in that system psychodynamic idea of primary task. What are you here to do? Why do you exist as a system? I am interested in what I would describe as the structural elements. So things like roles and tasks and communication flows and the way in which information is shared or not, hierarchies. I think those things are important to attend to. I'm interested in patterns of relationship. I think those structural elements configure patterns of relationship sometimes, and they produce things like power and influence. And you sometimes see the structure of the system or the purpose of the system in the outcomes. So that may not be the intended purpose of the system, but it kind of gives a certain thing, and that's good old fashioned systems thinking all the way back to, people like Deming and others, isn't it? The purpose of the system is what it gets or what it gives. So I do think you can explore it from all of those things. And then the job then is to be curious with people, isn't it? In terms of, okay, so this is what you're getting, or more provocatively, I think this is what you're making by doing things in this particular way. What do you make of that? Who finds themselves surprised that they keep getting caught in this pattern? Who thinks that's really what they want? And then I think you can then say, okay, so something's going on. That, this keeps happening. What's that about? And then I think you can then potentially start to explore some of the implicit stuff. What else might be going on here in terms of unstated beliefs, or perhaps loyalty? So again, drawing on some of the constellations thinking, people who've been excluded from the system that have history and presence, but whose presence isn't being acknowledged. In systemic terms, they create drag. There's a weight to their unacknowledged presence, and some people will hold loyalty. So that might be the stuff that hasn't been surfaced or named, and yet it's part of what makes a system unable to move forward, because actually some people are still looking backwards, and they're deliberately looking backwards, or they're unintentionally, unconsciously being held in that position because somebody has to try and remember what went before. So I'm shifting lenses, aren't I, from this to that?
But isn't that part of the work, though? As we're looking at the system, we're constantly just putting different lenses on and going, okay, well, what does it look like when I look at it through that lens? Okay, what is it? It's almost like when you're at the opticians looking at it through the different glasses till it becomes clear and into focus, isn't it?
That's it. Better, worse.
Yeah. Worse, but kind of better.
Yeah, and perhaps that's part of what we bring as OD practitioners, is that we bring a different perspective. And perhaps in the toolkit, different frameworks, different theories, we have a number of, like a menu, it's like a buffet of perspectives, isn't it? Well, you could try on a systemic perspective here, or what about a complex adaptive systems perspective, a purely social constructionist dialogic perspective, or a diagnostic, actually it's linear, it starts with A and it finishes with D. So all of those things could have value, couldn't they?
So, Gareth, you just mentioned it a couple of times, and we've never explored it on the podcast itself, although I've had training with it and applied it, and it's a really powerful tool. But you talked about constellations. For those that aren't initiated into it, what is it, and how do you implement it or deploy it into an organization? What kind of outcomes do you get?
So it's something that originates in the therapeutic space. So a German psychotherapist, Bert Hellinger, along with colleagues like Hunter Beaumont and others, developed this methodology for working with, I think, family systems issues initially. It then got kind of extended into various spaces. And Hellinger was a Catholic priest by background who was doing missionary work in Africa with the Zulu people and was there to convert them to Catholicism, but was really taken by their spiritual kind of practice, their way of being, their reverence for ancestors and for histories, and was really deeply moved and I think influenced by their practice. So brought that back with him, started to explore various psychotherapies, and kind of, I think, created this approach to work, very much rooted in the idea that love is the organizing force of life, certainly in human systems, and that families get into trouble when love is blocked. And he formulated this idea that there are orders of love, things that support the flow of love and health. And one of those is time. There is a precedence, so parents come before children. The oldest child comes before the youngest child. So there is a natural kind of almost like order of time. And that is important to respect and honor so that kind of, that sense of time. And you can see that in organizations where older team members need to be respected for what they've brought and actually for the fact that they've created the conditions in which newer team members can find their footing. But sometimes we disrespect what's old, People are fossils, they're dinosaurs, we need to wipe the slate clean. So we have all these kind of ideas. Then there's also just that sense that everybody has a place. So the order around belonging and place, and that in family systems, everybody has the right to belong. Even if you're a black sheep of the family, your right to belong is guaranteed because you are a member of the family. It's different in organizations because you have a right to belong only for as long as you're doing the work that you need to do. So our right to belong is different in organizational systems. It can be removed, and rightly so. And then there's the whole order around exchange, which is give and take or reciprocity. So that kind of sense that there has to be some relative fairness and balance in giving and taking. And that could be in conversation, it could be in actions, that could be in monetary rewards, it could be in the way that an organization gives to its community. So in the organizational space, it's a really interesting order to pay attention to. And then I think for organizations as well, Hellinger placed a really important value on acknowledgement. So the idea that things as they are have to be acknowledged. It's familiar to anybody who practices Gestalt. You start where you are. It's also familiar to people who practice complexity. You start in the present rather than going to the ideal future. There's something about naming the truth of what is. And then Hellinger also formulated the notion of conscience, which is about the different ways in which belonging is protected in systems. So we have personal conscious, that's the belonging to our groups. So that might be your family, that might be your team. And that's very much about how you stay loyal to the group and you follow the rules of the group. So personal conscious is the consciousness of the primary group, or our immediate belonging groups, family being the first group. And we maintain our loyalty by following the rules. And in Constellation's terms, we stay innocent by agreeing to the rules of the group. And we are guilty when we transgress those. But all children face the task of growing beyond their families. They have to grow into school groups and social groups. So guilt is a part of growth. From a Constellation's point of view, you have to feel guilty in order to grow and unfold and develop. But then there's also something called systemic conscience, which is the conscience of the system. Now, that can be a harder idea for people to get their heads around. But at the level of the system requires balance and harmony. So when things are out of balance, perhaps somebody's been excluded, you can see unconscious dynamics getting created as the system seeks to restore order. And that's where people can sometimes get caught up in acting out things that consciously they can't understand. Why do I keep on exploding with rage? And it's not necessarily about something that's theirs. It's something that's in the system that isn't being included. And when systems seek to balance order, they are ruthless. There is no care or consideration for individuals who get caught up in this because the system is seeking to balance itself. And I guess the practitioner of this work would look to surface those systemic factors so that they can be resolved, and then individuals can kind of almost like return to their natural state. And then there's this kind of more spiritual sense in Constellations of the conscience of the greater whole, or meta-conscience, which is, I guess, our connection to all peoples, all beings. So it's a kind of a unity conscience. And so those things are operating. And I guess the other part in some more recent Constellations work in terms of organizational constellations is this notion of the leading principle, which comes from the work of Jan Jacob Stam. This idea that alongside a kind of an organizing purpose, there's almost like an energy at the founding of an organization. So for example, in some healthcare organizations, they may be more oriented towards nursing or more oriented towards a kind of a medical perspective. So it's almost like an energy that organizes the way in which the organization performs. And a constellation, just to kind of round it up, is a way of mapping a person's experience of the system. So it's a living map. So you might use people, you could use objects, you could draw it on paper. It's just a way of creating a visual, embodied representation of the system so that you can think about how somebody experiences it and where the stuck points are.
And it can be quite profound, can't it, when people start to see the system in a new way, can't it?
Definitely, because I think constellations invites you to experience things in an embodied and somatic way. It's very visceral. So when you, I guess, come into what might be called a sense of the truth of the system from your perspective, you feel it. That's very powerful. I did an exercise before I really knew about the work. I was participating as an observer in a leadership course. So we had an external company coming in to run some senior leadership courses. As an OD team, we were there just to watch, to learn, because we were going to kind of roll the course out. And they did some structural constellations where the facilitator just put team purpose on a piece of paper, placed it in the middle of the room and said, find your place in relation to that. And at the time, I was in a bit of a cranky place. I found myself unconsciously moving around until I settled and realized where I'd settled was I was half in and half out of the room. I literally had 1 foot in and 1 foot out. And suddenly thought, oh my goodness, this is emotionally, somatically, phenomenologically true for me. I am very ambivalent about where I'm at. And that came with no words, that came with no interpretation, that was just felt. And it was immediately true. And for the rest of the day, I couldn't speak, which, as you're gathering, is not common for me. So I was just stunned, and that's what kind of drove me to find out more. Because I thought, wow, what is...
Yeah, and sometimes the interesting thing about it is that even if it's solving or working through a particular issue that someone's having or a challenge, the people that are observing it and maybe participating in it get as much from it often as well, don't they? They get their own insight into their position in the system too.
Definitely. I do think, Garen, there's an important difference between systemic family constellations and organizational ones. So I've been doing some training with a guy called Ty Francis, who's one of the leading practitioners of organizational constellations, I think internationally now. Certainly one of the original people who brought the field into the UK. And Ty's really clear that he very rarely sets up a constellation, that you don't need to be doing the physical embodied mapping, because sometimes it's not appropriate to have teams embodying their own processes, because it brings in so many conflicting things. It's very easy to represent, well, it's not easy, but it's easier to represent somebody else in a system than it is to represent yourself. Because do you use that opportunity to score points, or do you really embrace the embodied moment? So I think you can use constellatory principles and micro practices, so like making statements, using structural models so you can map things out on the floor. You could even set up something like Ralph Stacey's Stacey matrix that he kind of, banned from discussion as soon as he kind of put it out there. But you can set that up and you can get people to step into it and feel where they are in relation to a system's energies. And I think so you can do structural work like that. But I think Ty and others are really clear that the constellations form is better for family constellations work because you're doing that in a group of strangers. So I do think that's a really interesting perspective. So I use it a lot in coaching and maybe in senior leadership spaces as well, just to give people a different way of experiencing. And again, you need permission and you need to work people into that space because it's not something you can just whip out necessarily, because it can be very profound and it can feel a little bit weird and woo-woo. It's kind of like, what is this? So there's something about, I guess, how you introduce it.
Yeah, because I guess sometimes people can feel quite discombobulated for about 2 to 3 days afterwards, can't they, as well?
Yeah, I think it's, I think because you're working with systemic dynamics, or unconscious process, if you want to describe it like that, it's doing work at different layers. So you may have a very conscious kind of understanding. I get that. But emotionally and somatic, it's working through in the body, often has a very different rhythm and different time frame to the mind. It's moving at a slower pace. Like you say, it can take a couple of days for it to kind of click into place. Okay, now I feel settled with this.
We've touched on, you started your career in kind of mental health nursing. People love a People love a story about how people ended up in OD. So what was the shift for you? How did you move from that to the OD world?
Yeah. So I think I'd spent about 18 years working in child adolescent mental health services. And honestly, Danny, I burnt out. I think the work I was doing was very challenging. I was a difficult person at times because I had very clear ideas about my developmental trajectory that didn't really fit with, I think, the way the field of CAMS work was going. So again, I was interested in exploring fringe therapies and practices. So I recognised that I was becoming a problematic person in the team, a pain in the arse, if you want to use different kind of language. And again, my very good systemic supervisor helped me think about what was going on for me. And I recognised that I probably just needed to change. I think I'd frayed at the edges. My tolerance for risk had grown. So I was becoming a bit more blasé about things and just realised, crikey, that is not at all good. So I was just casting around for something else to do and happened upon an advert for a senior OD officer role in the health board and thought, what the heck's that? So read into it. There was something about coaching, and I'd been doing a little bit of coaching practice. There was something about teaching, and I thought I've taught on a few leadership courses, in terms of clinical leadership, and this whole idea about working with dialogue. So I came across Jervis Bush's work on dialogic OD, thought, oh, that's kind of has some similar principles and, approaches to the work I'm doing. So I just rocked up and had a go, and I think blagged my way through an interview. I think I just confused my colleagues. I had them doing 9-dot puzzles, and I told them stories about Alibaba and 39 camels. I think they just thought, what on earth is this? So, and I think I would probably say that it's taken me 10 years at least to settle and kind of have a coherent enough sense of what it means to be an OD practitioner that I can articulate that to myself. What is my work about? Because it took a while to I think to make that journey from therapeutic practitioner to corporate practitioner, and to kind of figure out the field and the bits of it that really interested me, because there's so much richness, isn't there?
What would you say how has your definition of what good OD work looks like shifted kind of over the time since you started?
Yeah, I think when I first came into the work, I was probably a bit like we joked about, looking for those frameworks, because I was working in such a different space that at times it was quite anxiety provoking, because I'd gone from working with small groups, family groups, to working with large groups. And suddenly you're contending with a whole set of different dynamics. And some of that work was really hairy. It was really difficult. People in real conflict, whose agenda may not have aligned with the agenda I thought everybody had agreed to. So some of that work I kind of crawled out of, thinking, crikey, I'll never go there again. So I do think I really wanted frameworks and a certain level of certainty, so that kind of whole thing that you go in with a plan. And I think over time I've just relaxed and kind of come to the idea that actually the really good OD work comes through relational connection, through that ability to be in a space with people and feel into that space, and to be able to empathize, but also know that the story that people are telling can't be the whole of the story, because nobody holds the whole story for starters. And if they had the whole story, they wouldn't be in the issues they were in. So there must be more to it. So that kind of sense of curiosity and, I think, genuine interest in what people are going through and whether or not there's a way through that. Not necessarily out of it completely, because sometimes situations are really stuck, but can we find a way to work within some of the constraints? And that for me has become the work. I think I've become a lot more humble. I remember speaking to one of my constellation supervisors when I was doing my foundation training and saying, I just want to do whole systems work. And Sheila saying, oh, get back down to size. Who the hell do you think you are? I think, oh, right, okay. So, that kind of sense that, because I think sometimes as OD, we want to go and change the system. We need to change the whole system. We need to be working at the top. And actually, all you're ever doing is working with small groups. A board is a small group. A team is a small group. Anybody is convened in fairly small groups. So you're always working at a local scale. And actually, that can be really profound work, and you are influencing the field, the system in whatever you're doing. So I think I've scaled down my ambition, and I'm really happy to do whatever feels like good work in whatever size of space I find myself in. And if that has a profound effect on a small number of people, then that is good work. And if that has a small effect on a large number of people, that is still good work. I think right sizing is part of it. And one of the things that from family therapy that I've held on to is this idea of irreverence. So this kind of light touch playfulness, not only about the situations you find yourself in, but very much about your own practice. So I try not to I do get very serious about my work. I can be very passionate and I can be really boring about it because I endlessly read and I'm really invested in it. But at the same time, I try and hold a sense of playfulness, and an irreverence towards myself and the work that I do, because that keeps us light enough so that we don't get too stuck in something. It also means that it's really hard to settle into a particular model because some people are really at home in a particular model and they go deep. I'm always at the edges saying, there's something else here as well.
Hi, we're just pausing this interview for a moment. Have you ever finished an episode of the OrgDev podcast and wish you had a cheat sheet that summarises all of the key points? Us too, so we made one. It's called From Pod to Practice, and each week in our newsletter we'll share a 2-page summary of the latest OrgDev episode, and it includes key takeaways, a reflection prompt, and one small action you can try.
And it's all in a digital format with space at the end to add your own notes and reflections, and it's designed to help you take the learning from the podcast into your day-to-day work. So to get your copy, just sign up to our Next Step to Better newsletter. The link's in the show notes, or you can visit our website at www.distinction.live to get the latest From Pod to Practice in your inbox. And let us know what you think. We'd love to get your feedback. What's particularly interesting you in the OD field at the moment?
I think there's some really interesting stuff around, I suppose, the beyond organisational development edges. So I think people's awareness now of the state of the world, the state of larger systems, political systems, goodness me, how could we remain ignorant to it? And I see a number of practitioners starting to move into this ecosystems kind of perspective on organisation development, people like Simon Weston, some of the stuff around regenerative practice. I think that's really interesting. I can't say that I have any particular skill or kind of connection, but I'm finding that really interesting to see the ways in which people are, I think, starting to ask bigger questions and about how can this work scale into those kinds of spaces. There's a really lovely movement starting to take place in public services, certainly in the UK, towards relational service work. It's fascinating, isn't it, that we are in this business of relationships and we need to articulate it as a thing that we have to kind of intentionally practice. But I think that's really nice, the move towards a more relational type of offer that is less about, I guess, measures and targets and much more about human-to-human contact or human-to-community contact. I think that's really interesting. I see quite a lot of interest, I think, in embodied ways of working, so somatic work. And I think, again, and Ty, the person I've been doing my most recent constellation training with, would say that nothing can be transformative unless it's embodied. So even when we're doing systems work, how can you get people to feel the shift in their guts? Because that's when it becomes real change. Otherwise, it's just upstairs in the head kind of work, isn't it? Those are things definitely that are interesting me.
So what do you like most about the work that you do?
I think everything that I've been describing. I just think I enjoy being part of a team where I get to work with really skilled, experienced and thoughtful practitioners. That in itself is just enlivening. I enjoy offering the different things that we offer. So consultation conversations that can be a one-off, that can be very satisfying. Again, inviting people into spaces, opening spaces, holding spaces, helping things flow through spaces and then closing them down well. So I think it's just about the practice. I think I've probably spoken more as a practitioner than as a manager and as a leader, and that's an orientation and a set of roles that I constantly have to kind of keep holding because the work is where the energy is for me. So it's really interesting.
On the flip side, what do you find the most challenging parts of the work?
I think there is something about the contextual perspective, and I've talked an awful lot about being systemic and being contextual. And like anybody else, there are times when I am very unsystemic and very uncontextual and full of judgment. So I think I find that challenging when I catch that in myself and think, come on, you've given yourself this title as a systemic practitioner. Get systemic. So I think that's challenging. I do think that part of the challenges is how we stay in relation with colleagues, especially, I can only talk about the NHS as a system, but it is so constrained financially, and in terms of resource. So the work feels very pressured and very acute at times. And it's in those spaces that relationships fray very quickly. So I think it doesn't feel personally challenged, but I do think it's a challenge for us all in terms of how do we stay in relation with each other and hold each other in mind enough to think, okay, so this is somebody beyond the role. And I may be meeting them in their role, and there may be some frustration and tension in that. And can I still see them as a person beyond that and welcome the whole of them, warts and all, edges and all, frustrations and all, because actually that's really important, isn't it? So I think that's the thing. And all OD work is political work. So we are constantly influencing and working relationships, and that's very rich. And I think that's very tiring as well at times. Those probably, Danny, are the bits that challenge me.
And then when you look back at your career, what are some of the biggest lessons that you hold with you carry forward?
I think I was sharing before about humility. I'm still working on that one. And about seeing the value of the work in whatever scale of work we're doing, so that all levels of work is systems work, in that you're doing something that may just shift the field a little bit. I think that whole learning around its presence, its use of self, it's our willingness to be active and experimental in the space, to be somebody who can risk. I'm very fond of the work of a psychotherapist called Stephen Gilligan, who has a lovely book called The Courage to Love. It's not a coaching book, but I think it's a very rich book around how we create, I think, internal coherence between our cognitive and somatic selves and then the relational field. And he, on a audio program that I listen to from time to time, talks about the work as being about kind of, with the analogy of going into the sea first and saying, the water's fine. Why don't you come in and join me, rather than saying you go in first and tell me if it's warm or cold? So I think that's part of the lesson as well, is that we have to risk. We have to be willing to put ourselves out there and to go there first sometimes. And that's not always comfortable. That's not always easy. But I think when we can do that and we can set the conditions for that, I think it can allow others to be able to do that more so. I don't think, again, it's a simple, I'll share and everybody else will kind of share and we'll all be holding hands by the end of the session. I think, we can be a little bit naive sometimes in terms of the power of some of these things, but I think subtly over time, we model the conditions, and I think, as I've used the word clumsy before, I think it's really important to be clunky and clumsy sometimes, and to model the fact that it doesn't have to be about slick performance. It's about genuine commitment and engagement, which sometimes is awkward and it creaks and it scrapes, and I think that's real, isn't it? It's not always
Absolutely.
polished.
You've invested so much in your career to date. You've done some wonderful programs and courses. How do you, at the moment, now you're a busy manager, leading a busy team, it's a small team doing big things. How do you make time and how do you invest in your own learning and development?
So I have to acknowledge that I'm a voracious reader and learner. So I'm always listening to a podcast. Right, I'm a bit of a saddo. So, my wife, Deb, the biggest life coach in my life, for definite 34 years, she's been my therapist, as well as my partner, sees me better than anyone else sees me, warts and all. She would sigh at the fact that for Christmas and birthdays, I just have a list of books. I've made my own Amazon Christmas list, of whatever it is. So I live, breathe and swim in this stuff, and that probably makes me a little bit sad around the edges and something of a social hermit. But so development is never far away because I'm always curious.
Given how much you read, this might be a tricky question, but are there any particular books or podcasts or resources that you'd like to recommend that others pick up?
Obviously, I'm going to recommend your podcast because I think it's such a rich contribution to the field. That's a definite. I think Simon Weston has a really interesting podcast called Edgy Ideas. Again, he's an organisational practitioner, but he's also somebody with a psychoanalytical background, so he has a very interesting take on things. I think that's very rich. I think, books-wise, I'm really interested in Georgina Woodstra's work on emergent team coaching. I think that has real resonance, and I think it's a lovely piece of writing that is that is very theoretically grounded, but very practical. I'm a fan of Sonia Blacknote's work on ways finding. She's a South African practitioner, a colleague of Dave Snowden's. I think her work with her ways finding framework is really interesting, and some of the work that she's starting to move into now in terms of, again, presencing skills. And I have a fondness for relational organisational gestalt as well. So Marianne Chidiak's book on relational organisational gestalt, the work she and Sally Denham-Vaughan do in their company relational change. So those are all really good things. And I think our OD network, I'm going to make another plug for it. People can get in touch with me on LinkedIn if they want to take part. We run sessions 4 times a year. They are practitioner spaces that are a little bit open space, that are rich. I think anything like that I'd recommend.
We'll make sure, if you're happy to do this, Gareth, we'll share in the show notes, we'll put a link that people can either connect you or go straight to become on board for that as well. Sounds like brilliant work as well. And I think you've also probably filled Danny and I's Christmas and birthday list as well.
Yes,
actually.
absolutely.
So some brilliant recommendations in there. We want to finish with one last question. And this is really one of the missions of the podcast itself. So what advice would you give someone who's just either starting a career in organisation development or just considering it maybe as an option? What advice would you give?
I think, goodness me, there's such richness to the field. Going back to the really early work of people like Ed Shine and others, there's so much to dip into. I think, if you're in the NHS, Do OD is a really great organisation to connect with because they offer free OD training and then they have conferences and network meetings. I do think joining one of the OD networks, it doesn't have to be my network. It could be ODNE. I think, again, those are spaces because part of what this field is about connection and network, isn't it? And about creating, I guess, a sense of being part of a community. So definitely explore. I think if you're interested in this kind of work, get a coach, experience being on the receiving end of a coaching experience, because I think those kinds of foundational skills are key to OD work, whether coaching is part of your formal OD offer or not. I think developing some skills in that, but also experiencing it and having that experience of being challenged and being invited to do growth work at the edges of your competence or your courage, I think is really important. Again, it's that you need to go into the water first yourself. We are able to work with people to the degree that we've gone there ourselves, and I really believe that. So I think those are important.
Well, Gareth, I want to say a huge thank you. It has been such a good conversation, hasn't it, Danny?
It has. It's been really rich. We've covered a lot of ground, but I think done in a really accessible way that everybody can kind of relate to and understand. So it's been really lovely. I think there's been some lovely moments. So I love the bit you talked about at the beginning about differentiating the role of OD and making it really distinct and kind of the work around that. I'd love people to take on board the idea of consultation conversations with kind of people and HR business partners. I think it's a really lovely kind of model that people can pick up, sensing our way into the system. And I love what you said about a buffet of perspectives being part of what OD can bring. So yeah, it's been a lovely conversation.
Yeah, it's been so good. I think some of the things I'm sort of taking away, I love the exploration we did of like formulation. Sometimes it's a fundamental principle, but we don't spend enough time defining what it is. I just love your access to language. So, describe things like relational ruptures. That's wonderful. There's one thing that stood out for me as well that I need to go and think a bit more about, that all OD work is political work as well. And that we have to enjoy it. We have to understand what it is as well. So I think people have loads of takeaways. So if people want to follow your work, Gareth, if people want to dip into your thinking, understand a little bit more about the things you're involved in or your networking groups to do, what's the best way for people to reach out to you?
It probably is on LinkedIn because, if I write, I tend to publish on LinkedIn. That's where you mentioned conversational spaces and other bits that I've written about around frameworks and, practices. So that's all on LinkedIn. The work on organisational trauma with colleagues like Ty and others is, again, found there. So connect with me on LinkedIn, and if you'd be interested in coming along to one of the network sessions, message me there. I'll I'll send you an invite.
A few people joining you from different parts of the world on the back
You're
of this.
very welcome.
Well, brilliant. Well, that's part of the generosity of the field, isn't it? There's always places to learn and different communities, and finding your place where you feel most comfortable as well, where you can start to really explore your own practice and learn from others as well. Gareth, we want to say a huge thank you. If you are watching this, and we say this every time, but it's so important, if you know someone that you feel would benefit from listening or hearing Gareth's insights, his journey, his way of describing his practice, and please do share with it. Danny, we get so many shares every single week, don't we?
Yeah.
So that's one of the joys of it. So please do share generously and freely. And obviously we all say this, but please can you hit the like button, because the algorithm gods love it as well. But most importantly, Gareth, we want to say a huge thank you. You've been so generous. You joined us on your day off as well. So just again, thank you so much for that. It's been a great having you on board today.
Thank you so very much for the opportunity and for the invitation. I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you very much.